So the presentation today is to look at how we and why we restructured the governance of Lake Edge in terms of positioning us for renewal. So a lot of this material came from a particular book called Flexible Missional Constitution and Bylaws that a group of us reviewed back in, I guess it was 2009, 2010. We started on this process. And so the ideas I present and kind of the structure came from the concepts within this book. And where the book starts out and really where we are as a culture talks about the fact that church has really changed over the last 50, 60 years or so. And I guess I'd just start by asking you this question. Is when you think back to 1950 or 60 or your history of that, how do you think people heard about or knew about church? A church in general.
Their friends went there.
Yeah, their friends went there. So, at the time, society was more oriented around church, so things weren't open on Sundays. There was no mall open on Sundays. People went to church on Wednesdays or whatever. So that was how people heard about it. Things have changed, right? So now you can go to the mall on Sunday morning and see other people doing things. You have school activities, athletic activities, just not the same as it used to be. So the question we have now is that we're really in what is more considered a period of mission outpost. So back in the 50s and 60s, when people thought about mission was outside the U.S., India, Africa. Where do I go to try to make a difference in the world? Today, that mission field has really shrunk to outside the door. So people aren't churched as they were 60 years ago. And so the church hasn't really, in a general sense, changed its structure to kind of respond to that. So the goal of what we went through was learning how to respond to that. So the implications that are up here is we've really gone from what I would call a church culture to a mission outpost culture. And these are some of the factors that you kind of have in that, in doing that transition. We've gone from kind of a functionally oriented, this group does this group does that, this group does this, to more of a relationship building organization. If you think to not only within the church, but think to other groups that you belong to, a lot of that is based on the relationships, personal relationships that you form, even at work, in terms of whether you stay or don't stay at a job is much more tied to the relationships you build. And our organizational structure really needs to reflect that as well. People have switched kind of from the concept of committees to action teams. There's a lot more focus on people getting in, I want to get a job done, but I don't want to be doing this for 3 years or 4 years or sign up for a 5-year commitment. I want to contribute, but I want to do it today. And I want to do it maybe over the next couple of months, partly because people are moving more. They're changing a lot in their lives. Lots of things are changing. And so they can't look that far ahead and say, yes, I can definitely do this for you for 3 years. The concept of working harder versus smarter, so trying to be more efficient in what we do, that's the change here. Focusing really on strengths. So what this is getting into is instead of trying to be everything to everyone or trying to do everything, it's really focusing on what are the strengths that we have as an organization and that we can show back out to the community. Risks. So risk taking is something that you tend to have to do in a mission outpost as well. Things are different. They're not, everybody doesn't all think the same. There may not be the same way to reach people in a mission outpost setting as there was in a church culture, so we have to be willing to take those risks. And then the concept of a top-down, kind of pastor-led congregation down to this more open, lay, clergy, shared leadership model. And that's a lot of what we've been trying to evolve into, in my opinion anyway, at Lake Edge over the last decade, really is this changeover from a much more pastor-centric, they know all, kind of give the agenda and strategies and what the next steps are going to be, more to a shared partnership with maybe some training back and forth between clergy and lay leadership, but also shared responsibility on what is this church going to look like, what are we going to do for outreach. So again, our structure at the time was, before we did this, was more set up on this church culture side. So things on the left side of the slide, and we really wanted to respond to the right side. How do we become more mission focused? So this next section talks about that the way people function, the way they do work has really changed in this same 50-year period. People have a lot of different gifts, and the concepts that this book really talks and focuses about is this concept of sprinters versus marathon runners. And so when you think of a sprinter, it's somebody that in a physical sense, is going to take a very quick way, fast burst of energy to get something done. Well, that concept translates over into how people do work. And back to where I said, if people want, this short duration, 3 months, 6 months, I want to get a project done, they're more sprinters. Other people are more marathon runners. They're willing and like that kind of longer term pace over a longer period of time to accomplish a goal. They're willing to wait a decade for change to occur, 5 years. And that's more the way our committees at the time were set up. Is you had a typical 3-year term, and then somebody was always rotating off, but you had a long period of time to kind of get in, absorb the history, get a better sense of how that group worked, and then make a change. And that's just not how people are typically responding in community organizations today. And I think if you think probably similar to your work environment as well, you're more in these kind of sprint, short-term, here's a 3-month, 6-month project, not here's something you're going to work on for the next 5 years of your life. There are exceptions, and so not meant to be exclusive, but a general cultural shift. So given that, churches have been organized around marathoners because they could. 50 years ago, people attended churches. That was the culture. On Sunday, there was not much else to do, and on Wednesday nights or whatever night of the week, people would come, and they'd come to these committee meetings because that was the way the community worked, and the community was structured around that. Given that, we had long-term committees. We had regular meetings, whether they were needed or not. So you met monthly, even if there really wasn't an agenda. It was just, we meet on the third Tuesday of every month, or whatever it was. And a lot of time also was typically spent on what were considered maybe minor details. So one of my favorite stories from Leadership Council 6 or so years ago when I first started that illustrates this point is we spent probably a half an hour talking about whether or not to take the Coke machine that the trustees had put in the entryway out the back of the church, whether we should take that out of the church, because we had seen complaints about it, and we were trying to debate, how many people would complain? Was it worth the money we were making back and forth? It's not that that particular concept was unimportant. It was very important to the people at the time, but it's not really something you want your high strategy executive team thinking about. Something maybe 2 people could probably make that decision. So it's that shift in thinking between the detail work, the minor work, that maybe you could delegate to a couple of people to this bigger, broader picture of work. So the next section really gets into how do we apply that. So each of these points in here, 28 principle, all the way down through standing boards and committees. I'll walk through a slide for each one and kind of give you a sense of how we change the structure and why. So the 20-80 or 80-20 principle, also called the Pareto Principle, the concept before was that 20% of the people did 80% of the work. And I think if you look at our church and other churches, you always had similar faces. They either rotated back through the same committee, or it was, you were on trustees, now you're going to be on finance, or you're going to be on leadership council, or whatever, and you kind of rotated through. The new way is to try to apply that 20-80 principle in a different manner. So more looking at 20% of your decisions driving 80% of your ministry results. Getting at what are those big ticket items, or if you want to look at, say, a glass jar, what are the big rocks you want to put in that jar and stack up before you start pouring all the sand to fill in the nooks and crannies. The big rocks in that case would be those 20% decisions. 80% of the decisions then generate 20% of the ministry results. That's the flip side, right? So some of these smaller things, the Coke machine, which color cups to serve coffee in, whether they should be plastic or china or whatever, they don't really generate ministry results. They kind of generate that small fraction, not an unimportant fraction, but a small fraction. So church leadership, the concept was that church leadership would focus on these 20% decisions that would drive that 80% of the ministry results, and delegate out to small work teams the 80% stuff. And the work teams could be, in the concept that we envision, as small as 1 or 2 people. And we have examples of that. We have people that are in charge of putting together the communion on Sunday. It's not a committee that does that anymore. Of 10 people that rotate by month, it's a couple of people that get together and they've kind of shared that responsibility faithfully week in, week out. We have people that refill the pews, the cards that go on the pew racks. Again, not a committee, that's a delegated out task. Somebody took that on. That's a ministry that they're providing to the church. So the key problem, or key element, I guess you could say, in this is trust. People guess in this congregation, I've seen it elsewhere as well, kind of think that everybody wants to know everything about how everything works. I don't really think at the end of the day that's true. They want to trust that somebody's going to do it without messing up or without doing something fundamentally to change the direction of the way the congregation is going. So trust becomes kind of that key essential building block upon which all the rest of this either works or falls apart. And that's one of the themes that we'll end up coming back to when we get a little further into how we do communication. Because I think communication is one of the keys of building that trust and kind of, in our case at Lake Edge, I think rebuilding that. So the Congregational Meeting, which is a UCC forum, is the vehicle for making kind of that 20% decision format. And these are not meant to be an exhaustive list, but this is a list of some of the things that the congregation as a whole, through a congregational meeting, would make decisions on. Ministry direction. If we decided tomorrow we didn't want to be UCC, we want to be Lutheran or Catholic or something, that's not something that a board in this church is going to decide. That would be a wider congregational meeting decision-making process. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but ministry outcomes. So what are the strategic objectives? What does this church want to be known for? Does it want to be known for mission work? Does it want to be known for teaching or for preaching or whatever? All those outcomes, those high-level metrics, if you will, those things that kind of build stuff and provide direction for all the committees, including this one, that big-level stuff should come out of the congregational meeting. It may not be debated and decided, it won't be debated necessarily from the standpoint of, hey, we have a blank piece of paper, let's get 100 people together to figure it out, but ultimately the congregation needs to make that call. So if somebody needs to recommend it to them, the congregation would vote on that and we come out with outcomes. Approving a ministry plan. So again, big picture. If we want to change the big picture direction of the congregation, it's a congregational thing. If any of those things then require substantial discussion, so it's something that we start debating and we're not able to get through that in a reasonable amount of time, the concept here is that the lay leadership, whether it's a IFF board or the leadership council, would provide some kind of process for input and outside discussion. We did that with this particular process when we rolled out this new structure. We held about a half dozen total forums with individual groups, both invited the wider congregation, then we had specific ones with individual committees as our process. Get some input on it, we made some tweaks, made some changes, came back with another round of that, got some input. So when we actually got to the vote process in front of the whole congregation, it went pretty smoothly. There were a couple questions, which is great. People couldn't attend that process, and that's fine, but the concept is you want to smooth that out, improve the communication, and also improves trust. So 20%ers, so a couple other things would determine by the congregation is issuing or taking away a call. So when Pastor Lex was called to the congregation, that's not a decision that was made by a committee of 2 people. That was a vote taken by the congregation. Major program decisions. If we decided to completely abolish our education program or abolish BOCO because we didn't want to do mission anymore, or we wanted to stand up another brand new committee to do maybe focus on homeless outreach ministry, we wanted to direct 50% of our dollar or income to that. That would be a major shift in how we work as a congregation, and that would need to go through this process with the congregational meeting. Acquiring or selling property. So maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I first came here, at the time we owned the house next to the church in that direction, and we were going through a process of should we keep that, should we sell it. Again, a decision that was made by the congregation in a congregational meeting, not by 3 people sitting in a dark room. Electing the officers to the leadership council, that was put in the hands of the congregation again to provide them an opportunity to have input into who's leading the congregation. The congregational meeting, on the other hand, doesn't make operational decisions. So the concept is not to say which curriculum should we pick for Sunday school, or should we sponsor this particular organization within BOCO or that one. Those are operational decisions. They're carried out after you look at the big picture, the broad metrics of what we want to accomplish as a congregation, we turn that over into other people to make those decisions. So it's not meant to be set up to do that. And this is consistent, very consistent with the way the UCC understands its congregational polity. So this is not something that we kind of ripped away from some other denomination and said, oh, sounds great, let's impose it upon UCC. This is right in line with our congregational polity. So no changes really to anything that we were doing in the past there. This is where the change starts to occur. So a leadership council, this kind of second layer of congregational decision making. At the time when we started this, the body wasn't called leadership council, and it was representative or it had different representation. So at the time before the change, it was composed of the officers, the moderator, vice moderator, past moderator, the treasurer, secretary, and then 2 members at large, and then one, it was the chair of all the major boards, the 4 major boards. So that was what it used to be. Now what it is, and I'll walk through that, all the members are elected at large with the exception of the officers, so they're elected separately by the congregation. The intent of these at-large memberships is that they represent the whole congregation, not individual constituencies. So it's not like I represent, people from age 40 to 50 or people from, the southern part of the state or something. Really meant to represent the whole congregation. They're responsible, the whole council, for achieving the mission, the overall outcomes that the congregational meeting had come out with as what's the big picture direction of what we're trying to do as a congregation. They offer guidance, input is needed to ensure that the pastor and those other work groups are discerning what their call is, what the work is that they're supposed to do. There's a difference between guidance and getting in the day-to-day business of directing individual work groups, and that's not the intent. It's big picture guidance and then a little bit of course correction. That's the second bullet there. If they get wind of a board's going way off in this direction and it doesn't feel or doesn't seem like that meets the bigger picture of what the congregation's goals are, that's where they offer some course correction. Say, I think we need to kind of tailor things maybe a little bit this way, or maybe that's not the best decision. They don't have any program responsibilities, so all that's delegated out to the boards, the committees, the action teams. You can think of the Leadership Council essentially as an executive committee that sets strategies, does long-term visional thinking of where is this congregation going, what is it going to achieve. They might talk about things like metrics. What are some ways that we can measure our success or not success, if you will, failure at executing what our mission is. They also talk bigger picture on, do we want to recommend to the congregation that we change this aspect of our ministry or add this other aspect to our ministry. They're not doing the day-to-day, they're not serving coffee, they're not doing communion, not doing curriculum education stuff. That's all delegated out to the boards, partly to free them up to be able to do that executive stuff. The council, with that said, can't reverse major decisions by the congregational meeting. So, the council can't come in and say, well, we didn't like that pastor, so we're just going to vote that person out and put somebody else in place, because that's a power reserved to the congregational meeting. They just don't have that authority within our Constitution to do that. The action team, so that's kind of that next layer down. So a lot of work at the time we did this was already being done by what really were constituted as action teams. Not because we said that's what we were doing, but as we kind of looked at what was going on around us, these types of things were already occurring. We had an annual giving campaign team that met for about 6 or 7 months a year, and that was it. They didn't meet the rest of the year, and that team kind of changed and turned over as it needed to. That's a perfect example of an action team formed for a particular purpose. They met when they needed to, sometimes a couple times a month, sometimes monthly, sometimes not, and got the work done. The Bhutanese Refugee Settlement Committee. So there was a group of people that came together to try to help the Bhutanese families settle in this country, and again, formed for a purpose, and carried on, got the right volunteers together to do the work, and then when that wasn't needed anymore, they scaled that effort down. Identity and evangelism. We had a member who put together a team to take a look at how do we market, if you will, Lake Edge. How do we do outreach in our community? Again, another team put together, not as a formal delegated subcommittee of leadership council originally, but really as an action team to respond to a need. The cool thing about action teams, and one of the reasons we went to this structure, is we're trying to allow people to feel called to their gifts. So one of the changes with the action teams beyond the structure and kind of the sprinting thing is to give people an opportunity to respond to what God's asking them to do. And if they bring an idea say the leadership council or a sub-member, say, of your team, the intent is to try to help them along that path. Now, we don't, to my knowledge, have a formal policy on how we do that yet, but the vision was that, if one person comes and they can't get any support around it, it's probably not the right time for that idea. But maybe 3 months later, 6 months, a year later, they come back, or somebody else comes back, you start connecting those dots, and there's kind of that Holy Spirit movement through the congregation of, oh, that's something we should be working on. It's to give people that freedom to do it, still have it connected to the broader mission of the congregation, but not hold people back from what God's asking them, calling them to do. So that's the concept of the action teams. They meet again, as I talked about, when they need, as long as they need. Maybe 3 months, may not be, whatever. Team membership. So team membership is based on competency, not commitment. And what I mean by that is you're trying to recruit people who can further the mission of whatever that particular team is doing. If they can't meet, every third Thursday, that shouldn't, in many cases, prevent them from contributing in some way to the team. Maybe you have somebody that could write a press release for you, but they're not going to sit in your meeting every month. Another way that's been interpreted is, say, by trustees putting together a building and grounds committee that doesn't meet regularly, but they're on call when snow needs to be shoveled or toilet needs to be replaced, that kind of thing. So they're committed to the task, but not in the same standard way. It can be as small as needed. You don't need 20 people to make a decision that one person can make. So that's the concept. No term limits. So this was a little bit of a, outside the box thought here, but the concept here is if somebody feels called to do it and that's what they feel is their mission to the congregation or their gift to the congregation of doing whatever it is for 10 years, let them do it for 10 years. There's no reason to force somebody to only work 3 years at a job and then cycle back out of it. The term limits thing does not apply to leadership council. There is a forced term limit and turnover on leadership council, and the intent there is to make sure that new voices are heard at that strategic planning level. But for action teams that are working on a particular project, the concept is no term limits. Standing boards and committees, a little different than action teams, but fundamentally a lot of similarities to those rules. So we had and still have a few standing committees, BOCO, trustees, IFF, are examples. And again, the concept here is to right-size them. So if you had previously 9 to 12 members and you don't really need that many, maybe you don't need to go recruit 9, maybe 5 works, maybe 4 works. Right-size it to the work. Again, no term limits. If somebody feels called to do this kind of work, we should facilitate that, allow them to do that, and kind of work through what they want to do. And when they're comfortable moving in or moving out, let them do it. Concept between all this, so boards, committees, action teams, is an assortment of different size groups that meet at different frequencies for different reasons, all with a particular goal that meets that ministry need. Overall coordination of this was the intent is to go back through the leadership council. So, as I said before, one of the goals is to let people feel called to their ministry and do the work, but on the other hand, we don't want people just kind of running all over doing stuff that we don't know anything about. So the concept would be that ministry coordination would come back through the leadership council. Perhaps an area for additional work in terms of policy and how that would be recognized, and this gets into the other piece that I talked about earlier about communication, because I think that's part of that trust. If people trust that there is a process that somebody's not going to be allowed to create a committee or team or whatever that has nothing to do with the ministry of the congregation or is outside that and not get corrected, if they can trust that that's going to happen through communication, they'll be, I think, more able to kind of step back and say, well, I don't need to know all the daily details about what these 20 different groups are doing because I trust that they're all working towards the good of the congregation. Self-determined membership. So this is something I think we have struggled with recently, but the concept here was that as you put together these teams, one of the things they would do is create a policy, and that policy would have not only here's our goal, here's what we are called to do, but also some thoughts to how you're going to regenerate. So as people feel that they need to get off the team, go do something else, The concept was that you would have some type of policy that would say, well, how are we going to do that? Is that person then responsible for finding someone to replace them? That's one option. Is the group going to put out a blue sheet request to try to get more people on it? Either way, but some thought towards how do you get membership on and off the team. Structure and function. So look at how do you function. This team, team A may function differently than team B in the sense of maybe you require a majority vote in team A for any decision. Maybe team B is unanimous consent before you can move forward. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Document it so that people understand what the rules are and what the policies are. With that said, because we set it up this way, those teams are all given what I would call broad authority to make decisions within the parameters of what their charge is. So if they've got documented that our purpose for existence is this, everything within that space, again, as long as they're communicating with the leadership council to make sure they're not off in some far and distant place, but as long as they're doing that, they have broad authority to make decisions. If you look, say, at IFF, there's no need, for example, to go back to leadership council and say, well, we're thinking we want to change the curriculum from A to B. That's within the purview of IFF's charge, if you will, as a group, to make that call without having to go to leadership council to change it. So this is my suggestions, if you will, for next steps for your team, and alluded to some of it on the previous slide, but basically it's talking about what is your team's purpose? Why do you exist? What's your mission? What was the reason that you were called together in the first place? Set up some kind of organizational plan. How are you going to be structured? Are you going to have a group that's somewhere between 5 and 7 members, or whatever it is? Do you have a chair? Do you have a co-chair? Do you have somebody designated to do minutes, or do you rotate that function around? But basically some kind of organizational plan of how your group's going to run. Document the functional details. This isn't meant to be a long thing, but things like votes. Are you going to do it by unanimous consent? Are you going to do a majority vote? Whatever that is. Just some functional details so people get a sense of if there is a conflict that arises, what have we agreed that we're going to be governed by? Determine how you're going to obtain new members. What is your process for kind of regenerating yourself? This may not apply to all teams. If you have a team that is legitimately formed for a 3-month project, when we did the summer outreach project, we knew that that had an end date. There was no need for new members to be recruited into it, so it doesn't apply. But a team like BOCO or IFF that intends to kind of have an ongoing goal and ongoing mission should have some thought into how you're going to regenerate yourself. The last piece here is a communication plan with the leadership council, key stakeholders in the congregation. So the first piece in terms of leadership council, there's a couple of things that we've tried and may or may not be working now, but we tried the concept of assigning a liaison from the leadership council that would not necessarily meet every time those groups met, but be responsible for communicating between leadership council and, say, the chair of that group. You can come up with another method, but that was a way that we came up with. So I'm going to leave you with 3 slides, and they each build the same way. So the thought I want you to think about as you kind of read each of these is, these were some of the vignettes, I guess, that when we sat down and thought about, well, what's the reason for doing this restructuring thing in the first place? I went through some of the kind of the cultural change and the way people have worked has changed. What these vignettes really get to is, to me, more heart stories. It's the things of, these are, in my mind, not real people that we went out and found, but I think they're close to what real people could be thinking. So I'll leave you this first one. And then this is a quote, if you will, from what that person's maybe thought dialogue is in their head as to what they're thinking about as they're kind of walking by our church, not being churched in this particular case. So this one really talks about people wanting to feel connected to something, wanting that relationship, wanting to feel like they're making a difference, or they're part of something that's making a bigger difference than just getting up in the morning, walking the dog, going to work, coming home, feeding the kids, going to bed, and recycle day after day. So there are people that are trying to figure that out, and we have to find ways to be more responsive. This next one speaks to more of a church member, somebody that might have been, say, in this congregation since it was founded, or 20, 30 years ago. And this was in response, in some ways, to the comments we got when we started talking about this cultural change, and people that maybe had been here 40 years going, is that really what's happening? Or, okay, I buy into what you're saying, but then what? What does that mean? What do I do about it? You know, so that's trying to respond to their situation. Like, this place means a lot to them. They raise their family here, they feel the Holy Spirit's still here, but they're not sure how to connect or how to be part of this whole thing. Maybe they're at a point in their life where they've been on committees all this time, but they don't feel like, I can't really come out on Thursday night at 7 o'clock because I don't like to drive at night. How can I contribute? So this would be another type of constituency to respond to. And then the last one, parents. And I think, this is a real fear that new members at times feel is, hey, I want to be part of this, but I don't feel like I can fit in. I know I can't do a 3-year commitment to this or a 5-year commitment to that. I could probably step in and do X or do Y. So I guess a lot of this, to me, really comes down to how do we more quickly and more actively respond to the needs of various people in the world and our kind of missional outpost concept that we find ourselves in. The hope was, by doing this, it would also allow people to discern what their gifts are and find a way to contribute to the church with those gifts. And to kind of step people through that commitment of, well, I can't do a full-time thing, but I could show up on Saturday and work outside for 2 hours. And then they meet somebody and they form a relationship. That person says, well, I'm also doing this other thing. Why don't you come join me with that? And they kind of get more and more involved and they feel more and more connected. And I think that's a way to do some of this response as well to people and their situations. So, questions?
I have a question about the time that this was starting to be discussed. Amanda Elm did that presentation on Pathways to Renewal, and I was wondering how this restructuring fits into that. Does this encompass the entire renewal, or is there more to it that was anticipated? Or
yeah, so that's a great question. So just to kind of restate, so we tried, when we did the restructuring thing, we tried to find ways to connect it back to this renewal path. And what Matt's talking about is about 5 or 6 years ago now, we had a small group that did a study on a book called Pathways to Renewal. And at the time, it was recognized that this church was going through that typical cycle, if you will, of churches of had grown up and now was in some kind of a decline phase. And the premise of the book is that until you kind of recognize that's where you are and do something to kind of renew yourself and turn yourself over, you're going to keep going down that decline phase until you eventually close, right? So when we did this restructuring thing, what we felt we were doing was not doing renewal, but we were setting the church up to be able to do that more quickly and more ably. If you looked at our old bylaws, our old constitution, it took a lot more effort to form a new group or to kind of reevaluate what a particular group was doing. And there was a lot of sense of obligation of people felt like, oh, I have to do all this 80% of the work, even though it doesn't feel life fulfilling anymore, and nobody wants to come, and nobody's really doing it. Purpose here with this more fluid structure is we're able to morph and change as we discern what that renewal looks like for Lake Edge. We're able to then respond more quickly. So no, it wasn't meant to be renewal in and of itself, but more as I call it a foundation for building renewal on top of that.
I had a question on your 2080 slide.
Sure.
It cited the 20% decisions to do 80% ministry results.
Yep.
Can you define that for me? I guess is that something that is measured, or is that something that's an overall feel good?
Yeah, it's I guess it's a little more than a feel good, but a little less than a measure. So it's kind of I guess I'll call it a general principle of improvements or work in general is that when people stop and think and look at what are the key decision points that they make in their life, either in a committee or maybe in your own personal life, it's not so much those day-to-day smaller decisions, it's those big, we're at the fork in the road and we have to choose path A or path B, and you don't see that roughly, and it is a rough thing, 80% of the time. It's maybe 20% of the time. So it's a rule of thumb, I guess is the best way to put it.
Is there anywhere where it's documented what types of decisions, what categories of decisions fall into which? Because it seems that that seems to be sort of a sticking point that we hear about, where a decision is made and then there's a small uproar about, well, why didn't the congregation decide this, or why didn't leadership council decide this?
Yeah, so kind of a two-pronged answer to that. So there is a constitution, and at a very high level, the major things are laid out in that as to what the congregation can decide and what isn't in the congregation. With that said, the intent was that that constitution would be augmented by a set of policies. And the rationale for using policies instead of a constitution is that you can change those a little more easily, right? So, and I don't mean that in the sense of, today it's this, tomorrow it's that, but more in the sense of, to change the Constitution should require a lot of work. It should require, 2/3 of the congregation or 3/4 or whatever's in there, and a lot of discussion because it's a major change. If we decide, we want to change from curriculum A to curriculum B, and we vest that power by policy in a particular group, and tomorrow, 6 months from now, we say, well, we're not really comfortable with that. We have this other group that's now stood up, and their purpose is just curriculum selection. Well, if we had that in the Constitution that this group was responsible for curriculum development, now you got to go get the whole congregation to vote on changing it. Whereas maybe you can just reach an agreement between these two bodies on that change the policy, and done. So I would say that's something we've fallen down on the job since we did this. We've started a policy manual. I know the Leadership Council has some elements of that, more on how the Leadership Council is governed, but we haven't done a lot of the follow-up work, if you will, at the committee level to really define what those are. And that's one of these slides talks about kind of what are the next steps. And that was really the intent there is, and I guess I'd encourage that we go through that process now if we haven't really done it. But the intent there was to say each group should really be sitting down and going, well, this is our mission, and this is what we think is in the scope or out of the scope of what we do. And it was a painful process. We did some of the work, and it was a painful process with the standing boards and committees because on two ways. One, it was, well, now you're giving us a lot of freedom, we're not sure what to do with it. The other side of it was, is it okay if we don't do this anymore? Because everybody always expects that X happens or expects that Y happens. And that was some of the conversations we had with the committees at the time was, yeah, that's okay. And if nobody else picks it up, that's okay. That's the hard part of this. And I've done some additional reading after we had done this about churches that have kind of gone through the same process, and it all sounds rosy like this, but then they hit those walls. Okay, well, we always used to have, just to pick, say, a third grade Sunday school program, and then suddenly this year we don't have somebody that wants to teach that. And churches have then had to make that leap of faith to say, well, do we force it to happen and pull somebody in that doesn't really want to do it, or we just kind of wait and see what happens? And a lot of what, reading that I've seen and it happens is that kind of grace happens and people end up feeling that call somehow in their head and they step up and do it. One of the examples in the book that I remember was this church had coffee hour every Sunday, and it was the responsibility of Committee A. I don't know what it was. And Committee A decided, we just don't want to do that anymore. We're tired. We feel our calling is focused over in this direction, and that's not part of our mission. So they took it out of their scope, and they said, we're not going to do it. After 3 or 4 weeks, no coffee hour, people kind of getting disgruntled. Somebody came into the pastor's office and said, I'm really feeling a call to to do this work, would it be okay if I took that on as my personal gift to the congregation? And, of course, the answer to that point is sure, great. What can we do to help you facilitate that? And that's part of the process, I think, too, of Leadership Council and all these sub-teams as well, is trying to find ways to empower people to then take that challenge on and remove roadblocks where possible, or help them with recruiting, or help them with setting up their team, whatever it is. So.
Sort of related, it seems that there's also an opportunity, I guess, for a challenge, if you will, of sort of educating the congregation too. I mean, if there's a clear, because
Sure.
For example, one of the things that I've heard come up in a couple of different contexts is issues of expenditures. I mean, in theory, you've got a congregation that approves a budget, and that budget contains certain allocations.
Right.
But then yet, you still have members of the congregation who feel that they should be weighing in on how particular allocated pots are spent,
Right.
even though they're under somebody's oversight.
Right.
So, and I guess organizations can differ on how that, whether every expenditure needs to be approved, whether it's allocated or not, or so it just seems like, that's
It's
something that we have an issue with.
It is an opportunity, and I guess my take is two-pronged approach maybe. One is continuing the kind of that increased communication piece of, I think, not all of it, but I think some of that comes down to people not trusting that the group that's making the decision is making the right decision.
Or the decision that's right for that person.
Right, and
Right.
that's the other side. So when we come to the right decision piece, to me, I think that some of that, anyway, is trust. Do I trust the 7 people that I don't know sit in a room to make the call on where we spend this pot of money? I think the more you can communicate what you're doing and the choices that you're making and why you make the certain choices, the more it builds trust. It's not going to solve the other problem, that you brought up in terms of the right decision for them. They're more challenging, and that's one of the ways where I think policy, if we had written policies and you could direct somebody to and say, well, I understand your concern, but this is what we are governing ourselves by, and it's open. It's, policy manual is meant to be literally an open book, something that somebody could look at. That's another way. I'm sure there's other ways to solve it, but those are 2 that I would suggest, is increase communication and write things down.
Well, and it might be some of your vignette number 2 people
Sure.
going, I'm used to at least knowing everything.
Correct. Yep. And that's true. And that's that's again an educational piece and of the size of a congregation. And when this church was formed, there was a lot fewer members initially, and then it grew much bigger. And typically, when congregations get to that size, kind of above the 300 to 400 size, they don't know everything. They kind of break down into different silos and segments that know certain things about certain things. This congregation, in my opinion, was a little unique because when we got up to 1,000 members, we somehow were still able to feel in that sense of everybody knew everybody, like we were 250, 300. And I don't know why that happened, or I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but I think we're trying to learn how to be that other size right now.
But it seems though that in a way, somehow this, I think, maybe some of the discomfort is, seems to be a reflection of sort of revealing a fiction in a way. I mean, because
Sure.
the reality is that if you have the congregation voting on 80% of the decisions, really only 20% of the people in the room are really listening or paying attention or really, really have an opinion. So, that's sort of a fiction of like, well, we decided this. It's like, well,
Did you?
no, I mean, did you raised your hand or didn't, but you did,
Right.
and so I think this is great in terms of sort of taking that piece out of it to a certain extent. It enables, I think, maybe more of the decision making to be done by the people who are really invested and who are, competent to make those decisions. But it does then create this other issue.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
there's a, and that if you look at the structure from a pros and cons standpoint, that's one of the major cons, is that, it does start concentrating power, if you will, down to smaller groups. Your intent by doing this in a faith-based organization is that those are both competent people, but also people that are invested in the mission of what you're trying to accomplish. And at the end of the day, if that's not occurring, then in my opinion, it's the leadership council and the congregation as a whole's responsibility to react to that. And that's where having kind of this policy of and communication and oversight of certain things starts to come into play, where somebody's way off on the right side, you got to correct that. And there's a lack of trust, I think, in some respects with leadership council, people really respecting that is a group that is going to do that level of oversight and make course corrections. And I think that's an opportunity for us to find maybe better ways to communicate some of the things that are happening on the positive side.
In last month's BOCO meeting, Paulette Harder brought to the table a question of how can we, as BOCO, maybe help to foster more of a more general conversation at Lake Edge about what it is to be open and affirming. And it seems to me that there might be an interesting way to dovetail that with the restructuring, because it was interesting, the phrase you used, concentration of power. It's like, well, in theory, there shouldn't be a concentration of power, because if you feel strongly enough about something that you want to be a part of it, you should just show up and be a part of it, in which case the power is yours to be had. You just need to be there.
Yep.
But that seems like, maybe there needs to be some work done in making sure that the action teams are in fact open and communicating themselves to be that way.
Great. And communicating that they're there.
Communicating that they're there.
In some cases, people don't know who's doing what, because we haven't done a great job, perhaps, of kind of publicizing, well, this group is responsible for this, and if you want to be part of it, great, here's the contact information, call so-and-so, and talk to them about it, or show up at this particular time. Your next meeting is X.
It almost sounds like in that vein we could have almost a committee fair, go around and meet your committee members.
I think Monica mentioned something about that.
Yeah, recently.
Yes, we did. The
She was
giving
just talking
committee
to me about that,
It's discussed having an empty table where there's you could create a new group.
Yeah, and it dovetails nicely in the giving committee of people give more than just money, right? So the concept of the giving committee is also your time, treasure and talents, right? So same concept. For me, a lot of it comes back to kind of gifts assessment of what do you feel called to do? What are your gifts that you can offer the congregation? And trying to find ways to foster that discernment process for people is important as well. So.
At the same time, people, especially that are new to the church, don't really understand the history of the church, and they're reluctant to get involved because they don't know what the needs are.
Sure.
So that's part of communication too, is regularly, we kind of do it on the blue sheet, but I don't think we really talk very much about our boards and committees and action teams. It's like, we are feeling a need in this certain area, and we think that one of you could contribute in that way, if that's a gift that you have. It's different from the blue sheet, which is like task oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to march in the Pride Parade? Do you want to, serve breakfast at Sunday school? It's more of a communicating what our ministries are, what the needs in our ministries are, and asking people to engage in that. But
I know at people at BOCO, older members who've been around a lot had talked about this a few times, that years ago there was a a form, a sheet that people filled out when they were new to the church that talked about it was their talents and interests and that kind of thing. And you're going like this. Sorry, but I wonder. I mean, do we have anything that that serves in that function? I mean, it's one thing to go, up in front of the congregation and say we have these needs, and how can you fill them, versus finding out what do people do for a living, what are your job experiences, what are your interests, what are your life experiences. I mean, maybe we need, oh great, you are a safety expert. Well, that's great, because we'd like to do a workshop on helping these mothers figure out how to put their car seats in their car right, or whatever the case may be. It's just like we don't even know necessarily what talents and gifts we have,
right, because
we're asking the new people to make that assessment as opposed to us drawing on it.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's not. That wasn't actively maintained as a database.
I think Mary Hoffman was running a group last year to start putting that back together, and it hasn't been updated since that time.
And there's some conflict around the time and talent, the whole concept of the time and talents thing. So I think what you're saying is right. We should know more about the people who are in our congregation and what their experiences are. But I think we need to do a better job, instead of just having a checklist of can you paint or
cook or computer.
Right. I think we need to do a better job of developing the collection mechanism and tying it into our ministry so that they can feel called to. I might have lots of talents, but it might never manifest itself if I don't know what ministry it's being tied to in the church.
I guess I've always thought of the need to have kind of a for lack of a better name, a volunteer coordination committee that would kind of have that information, be it in a database, be it in their head, hopefully not just in their head, but anyway, some kind of database that they've kind of worked with individuals to understand what their talents are, also what their interests are, and then be almost a clearinghouse between the committee that needs something and then the congregation that has skills. Not that they would make all those phone calls, and so in my opinion, it wouldn't be a dumping ground of a committee saying, I need 7 people, here's the skill set, you make all the calls and you just send me who's going to do the work, but more as a clearinghouse to give committees back lists and say, we're going to have this fundraiser and I need somebody who can make posters, I need somebody who's good at writing newsletters, and I need somebody that loves raising money. Okay, well here's, in our database, here's 6 people that can do each of these things. Feel free to contact any of these 6, and then it's up to the committee to do that connection work, partly because they can explain the need better than that volunteer committee, but you have that kind of clearinghouse that's doing that matching, and in my opinion, that group would really be more focused on the congregation as a whole, trying to pull that information through perhaps more of a gifts discernment process out of members of what are your interests, what do you feel called to do, and then not kind of serving that back to the committee is only at request, so serving a little more. So it's a concept, we don't have that today.
I think the model website that we're basing our news site on has a pretty comprehensive time and talents thing. You remember seeing that?
I think there is something like that. There's certainly a Connect tab that lists their current opportunities that people can sign up for, and
I think
vaguely recall something where you can actually
like
kind of provide
like
your talents as a resource for the people to review.
Well, and it seems like it would also be maybe an important initiative for the groups themselves to really consider, well, what is it that you need, or what could you benefit from? Because I mean, it's not always the obvious, and it's not always, and there are some things that maybe you do actually need somebody with some specific experience or specific training, or there are opportunities for taking your project, your mission in a fresh direction with some infusion of talent that you didn't even know you needed or something. So it's definitely a two-way thing, but I think that would, because I just see that as, I see the lack of that as being a risk to this restructuring, because I still feel like, okay, now we've got some action teams and they're sort of becoming, kind of grounded in a way. It's not that dynamic as you would hope, I think.
And that's one of the other risks. I mean, the reality of another reality, that's why we had to change, that wasn't on the slides, is we were trying to fill, I think it was 60-something slots that were active committees, and we just got to the point where we had empty slots all the time. I was on trustees for a while, I was the treasurer, and we were at a point where they were supposed to have 9, they had 5, and they couldn't get 4 more no matter what. So then we were living in a structure that we weren't really living into. So your point is valid too. With the longer term limits, the danger you get into is closed-minded thinking, right? So if you have the same 4 people doing the same thing for 5 years, they're not necessarily going to want to reach out beyond their boundaries and start thinking differently. And that is a risk.
Yeah, or they just won't even know to do it.
Although those people can provide the continuity.
Yep. Yep.
So that's one of the risks, I think, with structuring, is that we have to have some kind of way to let people know, what are some of the, what was our mission?
Mm-hmm.
What were the goals to reach that mission? What did we achieve last
this?
year?
Yep.
What are we doing this year? What are we looking forward to?
Right.
And
maybe it's changing how we do annual reporting.
Should we do it on the website? Should we just do it? I don't know, but I know we need that.
The leadership council is that we did not know the background. Nobody really knew the background, or not everybody knew the background, and it was just a lack of continuity.
Yeah, and it's going to happen with the fluidity of people coming and going. It's bound to. So.
And that's, to me, again, why policies like this.
Yeah.
And you need documentation, good documentation.
And actually reading the documentation when it's there.
Yeah, but consistent documentation of decision making. That's, I think, where a lot of organizations end up getting in trouble. There's decisions are just made, and 15 minutes after the meeting's over, nobody even remembers really what the decision was or how it was, and you hope somebody took good notes.
Or why it was made, and living on the decision X period of time later, and no reason why.
Is there a mechanism for revisiting policies once they're developed?
Yeah, and that was one of the functional things, was as you kind of lay out how your organization runs, there should be some section in there that does that. Is it an annual review? Is it at a trigger point, whatever? When I was on leadership council, our intent was to review our policy once a year. So every 12 months. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires it. Again, because we're trying to be more flexible.
And then is leadership council going to discuss these issues, or? Yeah.
Sure, well, I've got it on tape now. Indisputable proof.
Because it'd be nice if we were all kind of doing the same thing.
No, we have talked about the need for reconstituting that time and talents process. And a lot of the other issues that have been brought up already tonight. It's a matter of where's our focus. I know a lot of the focus right now is kind of on the budget. Trying to make sure that we live in and have a good budget for next year.
That's good. Really getting warm. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah,
oh my
very
gosh,
nice.
that
Very
was
helpful,
great.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah.